Jonathan Smith, former Commissioner of Police, who now works in the private sector. He is a former Progressive Labour Party Senator and Junior Minister of National Security, and he served on numerous government boards. He holds a diploma in criminology and police studies from the University of Cambridge in the UK, and his latest book, Island Flames, focuses on Bermuda's 1977 race riots, which were the most extensive and deadly riots ever experienced in Bermuda. Mr. Jonathan Smith.
It's a real honor to be part of this panel tonight, but I do recognize that I'm somewhat exceptional in my company because everyone here has actually completed a book, and this might be the very first occasion where Oxford University have accepted a book for their library that no one's even read yet. But Alexa, before you go back to England next month, I can give you the book cover if you'd like to take that with you. The book will be available in Bermuda in about mid-October, I'm pleased to say. There's three parts to my presentation this evening. The first one deals with 1977 and how much we were on the brink of a catastrophe. The second part is ask the question, why would this be of interest to a researcher? And then the third part of my presentation is, what did the research find? The first part, 1977, was very different from today. Bermuda was on the brink of a catastrophe. There were significant societal problems. Bermuda did not have a healthy diagnosis at that time. There was a legacy of racial discrimination, an unfair electoral system that some say was gerrymandered. There was discrimination at all levels, particularly in the economy, a clear black and white divide. And then by the end of the year, the pending executions of Burroughs and Tacklin, 2 black men for the murders of 5 white men, raised the tension significantly. But the problems, what's significant about 1977 though, the problems, as we've heard from the other speakers tonight, the problems went back centuries. And I believe it goes back to the very first parliament in 1620. And who voted back then? All male, all white, all landowners. And believe it or not, you have to then fast forward to the 1968 Constitution, 348 years later. In that time, whites had an advantage with the property vote. It took 348 years to finally dispense with that property vote by virtue of the 1968 Constitution. In many ways, 1977 was the perfect storm for unrest. There were many, many ingredients to it. There was a growing mood of violence. There had been riots in 1965, 1968, 1970, and 1971. We were not too far removed at that time from the very influential to the black community, the Black Beret cadre of the early 1970s. There were many unresolved political, social, racial, and economic issues. There was rising tension, almost exclusively tied to race. The convictions and death sentences of Burroughs and Tacklin loomed large by the end of the year. There was a colonial regime which itself had become a target. Remember, the governor was the very first, the second to be assassinated after the British police commissioner. And then there was this classic leadership contrast at the time. The UBP leader at the time, Sir David Gibbons, white, viewed as privileged, contrasted with the female black leader of the opposition Progressive Labour Party, Lois Brown Evans. So you had this divide on the ground and also divide in Parliament as well. The death penalty itself was enormously contentious in 1977, and there was an anti-capital punishment campaign organized mostly by blacks, supported mostly by blacks, and seen to run contrary to the wishes of the white establishment at that time. So all those issues and many more converged in 1977. And as 2 successive Royal Commissions found, race was at the center of everything in dispute in 1968 and 1977. So why was this period of interest? It's a period of enormous historical significance. I argue in my book that it was the closest Bermuda ever came to a revolution. The Pitt Commission is arguably the most significant commission report into the affairs of Bermuda in the prior 50 years when it was written, and in the near 40 years since. There was also political intrigue. The Progressive Labour Party was fresh off the relative success of the 1976 elections, where they picked up some seats, and then a further by-election in 1976. So you had this rising black awareness and rising black political power at the same time. From a personal perspective, I had a rather unique perspective. I wasn't in the police in 1977, but I joined a few years later. And my affinity towards criminal investigations, of which I spent most of my career, was a launching pad for me to inquire into why what happened in Bermuda in 1977 happened. So the historical and political significance, Bermuda being close to a revolution, my own police background combined to make it a very intriguing period to research. And nobody had ever written about this period before. So what did the research find? Island Flames weaves together information from many, many sources, most of it public, but the real gold mine was contained in the UK National Archives, where the files had been held from public view for 30 years. And there are some very surprising finds in the book about the context of who was saying what publicly and how that contrasted with what they were saying in private. There's some enormous contrasts, which will all come out in the book. The period is also steeped in all the socio-economic, cultural, and political upheaval that I've described. Significantly, these were the executions of Burroughs and Tacklin, were the last hangings on British soil anywhere in the world. So that's the historical significance of why Bermuda was at the center and focus of world attention in 1977. It's also an era that was extremely violent. There were 10 lives lost in total, 2 of them killed by the state. The confrontation, the outrage, the political brinkmanship, the protests, the petitions, the riots, people were killed in the riots, and millions of dollars worth of property were destroyed. And quite simply, it was an era that the Commission later found blacks, by 1977, December 2nd, had clearly had enough. There are also similarities between 77 with 1968, and if I can just quote very quickly from the Wooding Commission, which kind of sums up that era. The corrosive psychological effects of racial inequality and segregation affected both segments of society and were at the heart of the problem Bermuda faced. Interestingly, the United Bermuda Party's own Black Caucus described themselves in 1975, this is their description of themselves, as used black people. They described the black experience as exploitive and dehumanizing. A UK military intelligence officer in Bermuda only for 6 days in December 1977 described it as such. The hard fact is that it has been clearly demonstrated to blacks that the white Bermudian still retains the veto, whatever the strength of black opinion. There is still a long way to go to racial equality. That report was buried in one of the FCO files. It was not commented on by anybody else, even though it was the truth at the time. It ran contrary to FCO views in 1977. But perhaps the 17 words that best define the problem were from Lois Brown Evans herself, and I quote, "We have swept a backlog of sociological, economic, and political inequities under a manicured facade to fester." 17 extremely powerful words. 1977 saw what I describe as a significant expression of black conscience, black voices, and black protests. And you only need to reflect back on that era. Every single significant black group in Bermuda had something to say against capital punishment and against what the establishment was doing. From the AME churches to the Ministerial Association to the Working Men's Clubs to the Progressive Labour Party to the BIU to the Bermuda Community of Islam were unanimous against the hangings at that time. But as I articulate in the book, the events of 1977 should never be viewed in isolation. There are many common themes of protest, some of which we've heard here tonight. And if you were to categorize the five main themes, the book sets out that they were these, across decades and decades of conflict. Race, economic opportunity, an immigration policy which favored whites and others over blacks, the education system and the results of the education system, and the franchise, the electoral system. And an argument can be made that of those 5 issues, the only ones substantively dealt with with results is the actual franchise system in 2003. There are still huge question marks over the equality of Bermuda and the results we're getting in those other 4 areas. So I'll conclude with this. The book paints a snapshot of 1977, but it reflects back, but it also reflects forward. I would like to acknowledge Cordell Riley, who's present here tonight. He's a former government statistician, and he was invited to contribute 1 chapter in the book to provide that analysis of what's changed since 1977 and what might still be the same. So I'd invite you, for no other purpose, don't read what I said, read what Cordell said, because he's got more letters of the alphabet after his name. There are many revelations, and I can conclude in the final minute with just summarizing what they are. A few of the interesting points that people did not know at the time. The governor and the security services were caught off guard by the scope and scale of the riots. It's very clear from the memos. The U.S. Marines, not known at the time, were on a shoot-to-kill order. Remember, the U.S. Marines used to be down on the base. The UK troops that came here were also on a shoot-to-kill order if they were under threat. That's how serious it was. The cabinet was split on several issues concerning the death penalty and the executions, and whether it should have been debated in Parliament in that final week to stay the executions. There was confusion, disagreement, misinformation, miscommunication over many of the legal and policy implications of the executions. Even to this day, there are documented differences between Dr. David Owen, who's still alive and who contributed to my book, and what Sir Peter Ramsbottom said. They had a huge falling out over the 1977 events, and much of that has not been known to the public, and it was papered over at the time. There were very intriguing findings from the UK files, which were kept out of public view for 30 years, but obviously because of the legislation now, the files were opened, and it was just, like I said, a gold mine for a former detective to come along, and they didn't expect me to find what they wrote and penned in their telexes 30 years ago. Thanks very much.
Our last panelist, Mr. Dale Butler, former writer, teacher, and minister of government, best known as the Fish Cake King of Bermuda. He has written some 50 books. Tonight he reads from the book Choir Number 1 and Choir Number 2 by the late Hilton Hill, and from the first biography written about Dr. E.F. Gordon in order to highlight the problems he encountered when he came here regarding race. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dale Butler.
Thank you to Governor Ferguson and Mrs. Ferguson, Alexa. First, I'd like to thank Curb, Winfield, Cordell Riley, and NAR Dr. Hudson, and unions and churches, and our panelists, all of those people who have tackled the issue of race. And already this evening you heard, why is my curriculum so white? Which was the problem that I encountered when I returned here in 1976 with an honors degree in history and English from the University of Sussex, and had the same issue, why is the curriculum I'm asked to teach so white? And decided to do something about it by publishing books. And the first comprehensive biography of Dr. Gordon was produced, Dr. E.F. Gordon, hero of Bermuda's working class, which dealt with race. And so when I got the call to read from my books, I was honored, but I didn't. It's not one of my fortes dealing with race, but I was surprised that I had actually written about it. In fact, even in fiction, race in fiction, where in the Royal Gazette Christmas stories, a church lost its minister, and they were expecting a minister from overseas, and they waited at the ship for the minister, only to discover everybody got off the boat, and they were looking for a white minister, and there wasn't anyone. It ended up being an Oriental minister, and he walked right by them, didn't realize it. So that was captured in fiction. Then a book that sold out entirely called Add a Little White, which I wrote I compiled a group of stories mainly because I asked a white friend of mine to come to dinner at my house, my summer house on Engle Street. The governor's even been to my house, and so I asked him to come to my house, and this was in January, and he said, well, I'll be away. In February, he said he had a course, so he couldn't come. In March, he said that he had a board meeting, so he couldn't come. In April, he said he was going away, and in May, he said that it was his anniversary. So I said, what about June? Can you come for dinner? He said, no, I have a funeral. So what's for dessert? Chocolate cake. And your answer is cut. So what's for dessert? Chocolate cake. Cut. They're wearing black tuxedos. Cut. Well, we're going to have coffee at the end of our meal. Yeah, that's what used to happen at the Rappers Club every Monday night when they had a dinner. Any reference or hint of color, like chocolate, cake, cut that radio show off. Any hint, coffee is black, cut it off. We have brown sugar and white, cut it off. They're going to talk about race, so they cut you off. Well, Hilton Hill was about to deliver this speech, choir number 1 and choir number 2, and they cut him off. So you were born, you had been delivered by a white doctor or a nurse or a midwife. There were only white nurses, white interns, white residents, mostly from abroad, who were employed in our hospitals. As a colored Bermudian baby, you were placed in a colored nursery, segregated from the white babies, who were kept in the white nurseries. At this time, there was a colored medical establishment supported by colored clubs and charities throughout the island, where colored doctors could practice. It was staffed by very kind colored nurses who cared for those sick patients whose ailments were not serious enough to require the more advanced and specialized facilities of the hospital. There was a little facility first located in the back of town near Frizzle's Hill, and in the latter years on the road to Prospect. However, it was not graced with the descriptive word hospital. Instead, it was called a nursing home. It was a place that provided services in place of a hospital for many colored Bermudians and was able, in spite of itself, to provide the initial training for many able and efficient colored nurses. Somehow, we have always overcome, despite the many obstacles placed in our paths. In fact, in my own experience in going to a black primary school, central school, a black high school, the Berkeley Institute, a black church, St. Paul's AME, I was constantly told it's not about race, it's about performance. That's how you're going to win. Now, back to our typical Bermuda-born baby in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. As school age approached, every school in the island was totally segregated. There were white schools and colored schools from kindergarten to primary to secondary level, never the twain to mix, even on Sundays. If your parents were Anglican Episcopal, you would attend the Cathedral or Pembroke Sunday schools. For example, from 3 to 4 p.m. each Sunday afternoon, white children had already had their Sunday school before the morning services. The Anglican Church was the state church, but in Bermuda, it had no ordained ministers who were colored. There were lay readers who faithfully administered to the colored congregation, worshipers in colored neighborhoods, in chapels, not churches. When ordained Anglican ministers who happened to be black visited Bermuda from time to time, they would be invited to preach to one of the chapels, or on occasion, they would be honored to preach at the cathedral or another Anglican church in the afternoon, but never at a regular morning or evening service. This did have a fringe benefit because it would provide an opportunity for the number 2 choir to be heard. Colored Bermudians were not allowed to join the regular choirs which sang at regular services in Anglican churches. They were segregated in choir number 1 and choir number 2. Choir number 2 was a colored choir, which sang only at colored weddings and funerals, lodge services, and other special events and services. There were also colored altar boys, ushers, and organists who performed only at these special services. Even on the playing field, seldom if ever did the colored Bermudians have the opportunities to encounter their white peers or to play or perform on the same team. Sports contests were segregated. as the school system. Certainly, there were no colored members of white sports clubs. In the case of adult sports, there were a few occasions when white teams would accept invitations to be opponents at colored sports clubs, never vice versa. A most prominent sports organization were not even allowed colored people on their field as spectators in the 1940s. The Bermuda government tennis stadium was built with tax revenue for the use of tourists and members and friends of white tennis clubs, which of course refused black membership. On we go before the cradle, halfway through a life already. Let us consider the colonial Bermudians' career, even as high school or college graduates. The only fulfilling career seemed to be in a profession like law, medicine, education, or operating your own business. Bermuda's segregation pattern certainly narrowed the job market. Take, for instance, government. No colored Bermudian was allowed to sell a stamp in his or her Majesty's post office. The limited levels of employment and positions in the post office of this island were as mail deliverers, letter and parcel sorters, and janitorial positions. In the Immigration and Customs Department, there were uniform colored employees, colored secretarial or colored clerical employees. There were none because general secretarial jobs were not open. So what's for dessert? Chocolate cake, and your response is? Thank you.
My question is to Mr. Smith. In the 1977 riots which you spoke about and you shared with everyone, my question to you, in respect for the governor sitting there, I would ask, the petition that was actually given by way of to the governor at that particular point in time, why was it denied and was never taken to the UK?
The record seems to show that there were actually 3 petitions. One completed around September 1977. That one was conveyed to the UK and was considered by the Foreign Secretary, Dr. Owen. And then in the final week before the executions, the record shows there were 2 further petitions. There is still some dispute to this day as to how many people actually signed, the total number of people who signed the petitions, and whether they were duplicated on the 2 petitions during that final week. But the petition, the substantive petition was conveyed to the UK, was referred to in the UK, and was considered by the UK. There's a really intriguing story as to the UK policy towards hangings. The official line publicly was, "We will not interfere in Bermuda. It's a Bermuda thing." What they didn't tell the public, and when I say they, not just the UK, the Bermudian Parliament didn't tell the public either. There were 2 recorded cases where the UK had intervened in other colonies. One was in Belize, and the other was in Hong Kong. That information was never public at the time. The UK's policy in 1977 at cabinet level was, we're not going to intervene, it's your decision, it's your law, it's your law books. You have to deal with what your law is. What they didn't tell us was that they'd intervened in 2 countries already, and with successful results to not have the hangings. But the substantive petition was considered by, or he said he considered it, by the Foreign Secretary, Dr. David Owen, who's still alive today.
You had a follow-up? Go ahead.
Just wanted to share with you back in the day, my history shared with you as a Muslim, back in the day, we used to hang. It seems like that's where the police speeches are going on. My question is, and I know very well. Speak up. Yes, I knew very well when it came to Block and Tecklin.
You actually hung them and you poured concrete right in the dockyard casemates right there as we speak today. And the remains are still there as we speak. So why would they not put on an island like you done? And let me just share also for the audience tonight, back in the day, our tradition is we bury east to west or west to east, whatever you wanted it. And when they had hung back in those days, we buried them on an island, we buried them north to south. So why wasn't that the traditional thing back in the day? Thank you.
Does your book address that?
My book doesn't address that level of detail. There is still the story to this day that they are buried in the walls of what was formerly known as the Casemates Prison. I think the larger issue which the book addresses, is the historical significance of the hangings themselves. It has never occurred anywhere else in the world on British soil since 1977. And the intriguing story behind the decision-making, and particularly what the politicians were saying publicly and privately, and the secrecy in which the hangmen and assistant were brought to Bermuda, conveyed to casemates, that part of it is covered in the book.
I want to thank Mr. Butler for being so articulate in expressing the difference. You can't hear me? My big one? In expressing the difference. It's on. No one has trouble with my voice. The difference between segregation and assimilation. And he outlined why segregation was unjust. And when I hear that we lost so much with integration, it bothers me because we gained by desegregating this island. Assimilation is different. That's social. Some people decided that they wanted to sit next to white people, join whatever white people had, and destroy what we have. That has nothing to do with integration. So I just want to get that straight. Thank you, Mr. Butler, for being articulate and dramatic.
This is not a question so much, just wanting Mr. Brown or Ms. Hudson to speak to 2 points that you brought up that I thought was important. Was this idea of paternalism, it's linked to chauvinism, and it's linked to patriarchy, and how you feel that these things have then been joined to create racial caste.
Bermuda, like most Western societies, if not all societies, are inherently male-dominant and therefore rooted in sexism. The paternalism that I was speaking about was the issue of connecting it to race, because that's our focus tonight. But paternalism, male chauvinism go hand in hand. We live in these societies. And as people become empowered along racial lines and racial consciousness or gender consciousness, then you can break down the barriers of discrimination and alienation and marginalization. In the context of Bermuda, what paternalism has accomplished is it created a society in which black people, despite their numbers, were fundamentally weak vis-a-vis the power elite. And we saw that manifesting itself in the 1960s and before, when, for example, we talked about the limited franchise. Most people don't appreciate that most of the majority of voters before universal suffrage were black. The majority of voters were black. But whites had greater voting strength because whites had more property in more parishes, and you could vote in every parish where you're in property. That's one part. Secondly, Bermuda has the distinction of being the only country in the world in 1968, after 300-odd years of racial marginalization, in the first quote-unquote democratic election. And there's some debate about whether it was truly democratic because the voting age hadn't been reduced to 18. But in 1968, in the first more or less democratic election, we had a population of majority black voters who voted back into power the same group of people who had dominated Bermuda for 300 years. That is the purest manifestation of racial paternalism. And we saw that in place for the next 30 years after that. So those are the various dimensions, and I'm sure Dr. Hudson would want to add something to that.
You mentioned that integration, that integration was erosion of the black community. And you pointed to male chauvinism as one of the additions, as one of the contributors to that erosion. So that's what I wanted you to speak to.
I suppose there's both positive and negative, and the implication is both positive and negative. As a segregated community, first of all, black men, and it's still true, are destroyed more efficiently by racism than black women are. And the fact that black families educated their girls more than they did their boys, it simply meant that chauvinism and sexism, male sexism, was less likely to occur. And there was more value placed on black women for a whole variety of reasons during the segregation. But once they began to get integrated, you know, black folks who got integrated or who got civil service positions, which was a form of integration, they became, they felt they were beholden to the white community. And since the white community was seen as superior, they took on the values of the white community and, in a sense, turned their backs on the values which had existed during the days of our segregation. So that black men were then showing more sexism than they did during the days of complete segregation. As I say, that the implications were both negative and positive, but because certainly it was no benefit to the black community for our men not to be playing a far more significant role in comparison to what the women were doing. You know, and even today I believe that black women are the ones who are more likely to be holding the family together. Our black men are far greater, in my view, are in far greater, more trouble than our black women, for all kinds of reasons and in all kinds of ways. But most of all, because racism is more destructive to black men than it is to black women.
All right, thank you. Did that answer your question? Okay, I mean, well, your observation, sorry, it was no question.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Christine Rhodes. I'd like to thank the panel. Fascinating. And it was an honor to be here. I've wanted to ask this question for a long time. Where do we go from here? How do we move on while honoring the past and being cognizant of all that has happened and without trying to dissuade any suffering that has happened? How do we move forward as a community?
Can I speak to that first? Because as someone who I taught for 12 years at Bermuda College, and one of my passions was to get us to understand who we are as a country, who we are as a people. You cannot move anywhere without having a firm foundation. And I am profoundly distraught that for the last 20, 25 years, we have not yet been able to get our history, our social studies properly situated in our schools. Both private and public. In the early 1990s, I went to the administration. We need to have a proper history program in our schools. I was told by the chief education officer that no one needed to learn Bermuda history. I know that Mrs. Leona Scott put together a very detailed curriculum on social studies and history for Bermuda. Very detailed curriculum. She's distraught because it was never fully implemented in the schools. Principals don't consider it important. Teachers don't consider it important because all you're doing is educating the student. You're not educating the student. All they're doing is training students to pass exams. So you get these glowing results, but you don't understand your country. You don't understand your people. And so when you ask the question, where do we go from here? We have to start from a common point. We don't even agree on our collective history. When we have a division over whether or not someone who was a slave and tried to free herself from slavery should be a national hero, and people balk at a sculpture on the cabinet grounds, it's amazing that we could not see collectively that here was a woman who was enslaved who wanted to be free. But we still argue, well, she tried to commit murder. Yeah, if you were a slave and you wanted to be free, you probably tried to commit murder too. So we don't have a collective perception about our past. And so if we don't have a common perspective, we can't move forward. But we have to try. And so we start with our young people. We have to educate our young people. I would say inculcate. We have to educate. Share information. Have open and honest dialogue and debate. Dr. Hudson, I love Dr. Hudson. She has written probably the most important book on Bermuda because this is the pivotal period in our history. But we have some disagreements about the relevant role of race versus class. But we can talk about it
And people can learn, I hope, from our discussion and our disagreements about the salient of race and class in Bermuda.
One of the issues I took up in the book, of the 1977 riots, is I wanted to give it some context, recognizing that it is almost 2 generations ago. So for the younger members of the audience, Treasurer Tannock and the young lady over there who asked the question, I've really written the book for that age group, so they can reflect back, look at that period, understand what some of the underlying issues were. That's why I mentioned Cordell Riley's name. I gave him total free rein on the final chapter in the book to provide just the analysis that this lady has asked the question. What's changed? Why has it changed? And where do we go from here? And I won't attempt to answer that because we're all going to want to go to dinner pretty soon. But on a serious note, that is the fundamental reason I wrote the book, to understand where we had been, understand why we almost killed each other, and where do we go from here? And really, as I reflect and feel the mood for tonight, I should have allowed Cordell a greater chapter, but maybe that'll be for the second edition. But Cordell really does fundamentally try to address that, and it comes down to statistics, it comes down to results. Do we have an economy that provides equal opportunity? Is our wage structure equal? Is our education system producing the results equally across blacks and whites? Those are some of the fundamental questions. But I won't answer the rest of it because Cordell tackles that very well in the book.
Thank you. This whole question of integration, and I suppose where do we go from here? Segregation is historically the longest period in Bermuda than anything else. We've all been segregated against. Black people have been slaves. Then, and this book about this lady, Dr. Ball, one of her big fights was to bring about equality of all people. And it just hasn't happened. I'll tell you why it hasn't happened. Because in the 1960s, when we were trying to get things squared away politically, we really didn't do much about anything economically. But we fought for integration, which meant this, the right to that job. In the 1960s, I think somebody started on it here at the panel, that there was one civil service that I knew, a fellow Richardson, who was some way or the other, some small job on customs. Mr. Richardson, he always came up in Parliament. Back again in the 60s, up in here. I tell you what happened in Bermuda. Instead of us having real, genuine integration, we had the race. There were no blacks in the civil service, no blacks in the banks, no blacks were even in the post office to serve a penny stamp. And when we raised came, and we got to sell a penny stamp, we got to do a little something in the banks and something in civil service, the white race raced away. So you've had a race rather than integration.
I really don't have an answer for you. Recently, Senator Jeff Barron said we have to tackle the issue. And then what did we hear after that? Nothing. I'm still trying very hard to get my white friends to come to dinner. And lastly, in the whole world, everybody wants to be at the 100-yard dash. Everybody wants to see that. I know for a fact because I was the Minister of Sport in the 2006 Olympics in Greece, and people didn't come for the heats. They came for the final. But at our Carifta Games, there was a tremendous absence of whites. So I think the younger people have the answer. They're more integrated into marriage. They don't have the experiences of the theater boycott, and segregated schools, etc. I think they'll resolve those issues.
Say that basically we need to work on a new social contract, and I think from listening to the past, you can certainly start working on the fundamentals. And that means a new tax system, a new way of dealing with things, a new support system for people that are in harm's way. We need a new social contract that's fair. We don't have it.
First of all, good evening, and I would like to thank the panel for their contributions tonight, and I also would like to thank Mr. Butler and Mr. Smith for recognizing my small contribution in this race thus far. I too left a funeral today and came here, and the circumstances of the death of the funeral that I went to were starkly different, Wendy, to the one that you went to. No, certainly both are, however, of course, struck the various families. And I wonder, and I think Mr. Brown, Walton, that you articulated a lot of the conditions that face Black people, certainly coming in the 1600s, 1700s, the 1842 Act, and thereafter. How do you characterize the conditions then and the conditions of Black today, and some of the things that Black, particularly Black young men, are facing? Are they a reflection of race? How much of that goes back to where we came from in terms of segregation and all of that, and how much do we take ownership for it now?
Well, I always like to start out with a quote from a guy that many people don't consider to be in fashion anymore. But Karl Marx once said that the past hangs like a nightmare over the present generation. And so we cannot escape from our past. Our past has shaped and defined the present. So there is a legacy of the past that impacts. When you have, I think the former mayor, Mr. Rodriguez, talked about the taxation system. Our taxation system has created structured racial inequality. Right? It's very simple. If you look at who earns, well, I did the study a long time ago, investment income, which is not taxed, but your wages and salaries are taxed. So there's a structural imbalance right there, just in our taxation system. We have a fundamental divide that has diminished to some extent over the past 30 years, but we still have challenges in terms of opportunity. We should have more opportunities given to those who hadn't had opportunities over the past 25 years. Those opportunities were not realized. That's part of the challenge that we face today. So we need to ensure that we, and with the rhetoric, I heard people, I know I get in trouble, I don't care. People keep talking about we need to continue a big conversation. We don't need a big conversation. What we need to do is reallocate our resources. So when you talk about giving out government contracts, make a conscious effort to spread the work around. It's not difficult. And so you give people opportunity. If you've never had a government contract, but you're in a particular area, you work out on something smaller, then you go to something larger. Contracts should not be allocated to those who have an inside link or those who have a special connection. It should be designed to reflect the objectives that you want to accomplish. And if your objective is a greater sense of equality, which should be the ethos of every government that actually cares about people, then you would have that reflected in your policy. Now it's difficult. You know, in a country that's a majority Black, you should see Black capital alongside white capital. Where's the, investment people know the terminology. What's the seed funding? What's the code when you want to start up a company? Venture capital. Where's the investment capital? Where's the venture capital for those who have ideas but no capital? If you have an inheritance of millions of dollars, you can start many businesses and fail until one works. If you don't have access to capital, you start one business, it fails, and the bank says you're a credit risk, so you don't get another chance. Okay. So if we're really serious about equality, then the most important fundamental premise of equality is equality of opportunity. And so when we get to that point in a real, sincere way, then some of these issues, but not all, some of these issues will abate.
Good evening, everyone. My question to you is basically when you were talking about Bermuda's history in the schools. Was that recent that you got those answers? My question to you is, all of Bermuda's schools, Bermuda's history, is that being taught in its fullness?
No, not at all. In fact, it's so embarrassing that I think 3 months ago, I was talking to these two young girls. One goes to public school, one goes to private. I said, who's the premier? They didn't even know who the premier is. Who runs Bermuda? They said the governor. I said, well, he has some responsibility. But they had no sense of how Bermuda works. And so you have people who grow up in this country, they live in this country, they work in this country, but they're not connected at all to how it works. And if you don't have that mindset, how do you understand issues? How do you weave through what politicians say versus the reality? Because I can assure you, sometimes what politicians say and the reality are two very different things.
Could I ask you a question?
Just a follow-up question.
Okay.
Has there anything being done about it? It's like, as far as, is there a panel, any organization?
I can say Leona Scott lobbied and lobbied and lobbied the government, this government and the previous government, to ensure that that curriculum is put into the school. It exists on paper, it is not taught. Principals don't mandate it, teachers don't mandate it, the ministry doesn't mandate it. They need to mandate it.
My question is to Jonathan Smith. In your book, I was kicked out of a big conversation meeting for black people that was held at Berkeley about 4 years ago. And the reason why I wanted to go as a white person is because I have a black mother and a white mother who I respect, the one who brought me up and the one who birthed me. I felt I had a right to be there. I wasn't there to judge, but Mr. Commission verbally abused me and told me to get out, which I did. And then sitting outside, I wanted to go because there were 3 doctors on the panel. When they had the white conversation meeting, there were no doctors on the panel. One came from South Africa, one was a lecturer at a college in the States, and I can't remember who the 3rd person was. But because I got kicked out, I was sitting on the steps outside the auditorium crying. And I heard that Buck Burroughs and Larry Tacklin were martyrs for the Black Panther movement, and that's why they were hung. Can you tell me whether they were, as a detective, whether they were guilty or not guilty of the things they were charged with?
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I'll address that question on a number of different levels. I was not in the police in 1977. I'm not at all. I think the fundamental issue is that it came before the Royal Commission, the Pitt Commission, in 1978. There were blacks who appeared before the commission who were convinced that the system convicted Burroughs and Tacklin. They were prepared for a time to dismiss what the scientific evidence was, what the eyewitness evidence was, what the firearm evidence was. Because in their mind, they had been conditioned that this white system was against blacks, was always going to be against blacks, and would always convict blacks. That's all in the commission documents. I don't attempt to rewrite any of that. I just try to put it into context. They were convicted by a jury. The then Constitution allowed for a prerogative of mercy committee who declined to reverse that decision. The decision then went to the Supreme Court in Bermuda. 6 hours before they hanged, Lois Brown Evans made her final attempt to say, stop, you must stop this. It was against the law in Britain to hang people, had been for 8 years. But all that was cast aside because the law in Bermuda was that they could hang. So time just doesn't permit to get into the nuances of the case. They were convicted of the law at that time, convicted of heinous crimes, of assassinating a governor, a police commissioner, an ADC, and 2 innocent shopkeepers. What is symbolic is what lessons I think Bermuda can learn out of that doldrum that we were in. And it was a doldrum. And the final line in my book is something to the effect of, wherever we go from here, let's try and make sure that the next Royal Commission, whenever it is, doesn't refer to race as being the center focus of the division. Because we've already been through 2 commissions with that, 68 and 77. We haven't had a Royal Commission on that sort of issue ever since.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith.
Two observations. One, I appreciate what Mr. Brown said. We keep having a big conversation, not followed by any constructive
action. So my question is for the panel, I mean, how long are we going to continue to talk? And what does real life resolutions look like? I mean, certainly, I think it's significant for us to ask this question because something that Mr. Smith said in his book, he pointed out 5 significant things that were rife in the time of the riot. Could you repeat those for me, Mr. Smith?
The 5 issues: race, economic opportunity, an immigration policy which favored whites, the education system and the results being produced out of it, and the franchise, the electoral franchise.
Well, if I didn't know better, I would say that you were talking about 2015. I mean, these are significant things that are happening right now, and I would hate to see the result be as in 77, right? But the reality is, if we keep talking and not making significant actions to bring about resolutions, I fear.
Good point. Going to the next one. Yeah, that's a good point.
So I would like the panel to answer the question that when we realistically look, without reading your book, another shameless plug, without reading your book, where do we go from here realistically? And certainly not more conversation, but realistically. We've talked about the things that need to change, taxation. We talked about the things that you cannot continue to expect people to operate without having a fair wage. So unless we address those type of economics, then, as I said, I have a great fear.
Okay, and we've posed that question, and in another way, someone earlier talked about how do we fix the problem, and we talked about fixing the curriculum, the history and social issues. Fixing the inequalities, relying or looking to our young people to do what obviously we cannot or have not done. A new social contract, I think Mr. Otterbridge had talked about the school system. So posing the question, and I think everybody has felt the dissonance, for want of a better word, and after hearing each of the panelists, the automatic question is, okay, so where do we go from here? They've answered the best way that they could. I'm not sure if we can find the answer definitively in this room right now, but we can go away with it and make up in our own minds the fact that it does need to be fixed, that we felt the dissonance, and that we can't stay where we are. Just to settle the question that this panel may not be able to have the full answer right now.
Paternalism allows a white child to call an elderly man boy. That's paternalism. And so the black male during slavery was never given a chance to mature because he was always referred to as boy. An author, Benjamin Ringer, wrote a book, We the People and Others, made one distinct contribution to the colonial language in that he defined the difference between colonization and colonialization. And guess which one took place in Bermuda? We were colonized specifically so that the way Bermuda is designed and structured is to service white people. We just get the benefit from it. But the way it was structured was to serve whites.
So your second observation? Second observation? Your second observation?
Yes, strictly. The Gombe. The Gombe evolved out of slavery to meet a specific need. The young black males were angry. They wanted to confront the white slave owners. But the elderly black slaves told them, if you do, they will shoot you and kill you. And because we valued life, they then were told the secret of the Gombe. And so they went to the master's yard and they performed a theatrical act where they danced and they flipped and they jumped. And in their hands they had hatchets and spears and knives. And the master thought it was a theatrical performance. But in his mind, he was exercising himself of his anger. And he was killing his master every time he chopped the ground, every time he cut the ground. And then he went home, freed.
Thank you, Mr.
My last
Smith.
thing, quickly, there's a book put out by the Bermuda College. It has an interview by Arnett Jackson. He interviews an elderly black male, and this black man says, "There's your cloak boy, sure are smart. Put the Portuguese in business and put us in sports."
Thank you.
Okay. With all due respect, I feel that we keep on hearing this question, where do we go from here? Why are we asking the panel? Why should the panel have all the answers? Where are we going to go from here? I know Sister Linda from my time in government. Linda, right? Yes, yeah, okay. And I know that she's active in the union, so she's doing something. Where is she going to go from here? Where is the union going to go from here? I think we're always looking externally. Panel don't have all the answers. They research the subject, they live the subject, they experience, but so have we all. We can all write a book on something. We can all give guidance on an area. So when I hear, where are we going to go, and the panel doesn't have the answers, we shouldn't expect them to have the answers. We have the answers. When you leave here tonight, what are you going to do to make a change? Tomorrow morning, what are you going to do? We all have that inside of us. Where are we going to go from here? Ask yourself. Make the change. Let's start with us. And I just feel that we're always looking externally, right? Always externally. The youth, well, they might have the answer. I think somebody on the panel said maybe the youth can make a change. But they're only going to follow our example. They're not going to pull something out of thin air. So where do we go from here? It depends on what we do from today.
Thank you very much. Very good.
I just want to make a comment. Admiral Simmons, he made a very good point about Dr. Barbara Ball. During my time in our household, she was very famous with us. She was a woman before her time. She really was. For young people who were here, who never even heard of her name, you need to research that. That's really, really part of Bermuda history, Dr. Barbara Ball. My other comment is that I want to say that this program that we're having here tonight needs to go to Somerset, needs to go to St. George's. We need to have it again because there's so many people who are not even here tonight. Most of them I feel is young people that need to be here. I was able to bring my nephew, and I'm happy that he's here because so much that he doesn't know. And as we said before, and as the young lady said also, we need to make sure that this gets into our school. We need to educate all our children. This is 2015. There's no reason why this cannot get into our schools. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I want to make a comment about Dr. Ball, because when I was doing the research for this book, Mr. Simmons allowed me to go into the BIU archives. I never remember that, Mr. Simmons. But he told me I could use whatever I found there.
Never paid for that.
The outside was a room full of boxes that were unmarked. And so I spent one summer going through every single box. And I found a letter in there, a letter written by Dr. Ball to Mrs. Simmons. And she had been invited to Government House for a tea party. You don't do many of those these days. But she was invited to a tea party. And she said that when she went to the tea party, she was writing to you, Mrs. Simmons. She says, I went to the tea party, and the governor he wouldn't shake my hand. I think they have no intention of ever recognizing them. And it was just very poignant that a very simple letter she wrote to her friend, fellow traveler in trade unionism, but feeling a sense of complete marginalization. And I just thought that helps to bring, you reading from her book today, and your comment, lady, about the power of Dr. Ball. It truly was very symbolic and gave us hope for progress.
I just wanted to comment on what the young lady who was standing over there said about where do we go from here, how do we fix this. If we had the answer to that, I think Bermuda needed to worry about its balance of payments because we could sell it all around the world. We haven't got to that place. Nobody has yet managed to fix this. And I think we have to remember that the history, which I think is so important, that we understand the history. And it's not taught properly in our schools. We don't teach black history in our schools. We're a majority black country. We don't teach it. And it's a real, not even at college level. There are teachers who go above and beyond to do it. There's no doubt about that. There are people that are included in their social studies where they can, but there's no curriculum, no set curriculum that teaches Black history, even African history, Bermudian history. There is nothing there that teaches, and yet we're a majority Black country, and that is still not happening. That's one of the biggest things we need to do, because by creating and teaching history correctly, we create empathy between people. And it's what we need to understand. When you be able to step in somebody else's shoes and look from their perspective, then you're able to start moving forward and listen to what somebody else has to say. And I think, I know the young lady said, we've had enough talk, we've had enough conversation, but this is what we're doing now. And conversation is critical in order to understand each other and hear each other and listen to each other. So I would encourage the conversations, the dialogues to continue, because it's about learning who we are and understanding each other's point and listening to each other. I think we all stand in our own truth, but we have to remember that truth runs parallel to somebody else's truth, which is totally different from our own. But it is not to say that that truth is not valid. So I would just say there are multiple levels we have to work on in this community. The educational part is enormous, but I also completely support Mr. Brown and what he said about we need to look at our taxation system, because that would be the first step of creating some form of equity, not equality, equity and justice in our community.
Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Sister Winfield. I think just you cleared it up at the end there. When we use the term Black history, I think what we're saying is that we need a holistic history. And that's the important part. I think the piece has to be brought out holistically. And if we had a holistic history, then the full story would be told. And that's where we're going. I mean, we have, I think Walton has cited the fact that even though Walton and I would know a number of the people who had positions within this system, so it's not that the people are not there. People like Dale have been pushed, beating that drum for a long time. But in terms of, I think we feel a sense of frustration in the room, and that's natural. That the panel that's been brought together here, I mean, it's an august panel. We all came together under the Oxford University, and as our chairman said, that this is a very, really unique occasion that Oxford would sponsor something like this. But what we're doing, though, is just touching on something that's very deep and complex. So we're bound to be somewhat frustrated because we can't get the full story out. And perhaps our colleague here, who talks about the fact that we need to do much more of this type of thing, it is just an indication of that. I know Brother Walton was saying that perhaps we don't need a big conversation, but we need something that allows us as a community, and here we are, really a very tiny community, a neighborhood, in fact. And as Jonathan was telling some stories, of course, a lot of this I was involved in. Jonathan somebody asked a question about the petition that was taken to London. I took it to London in 1977. I happened to be going to university in London, and
make it succinct, Mr. Butler.
But the thing about it was that it was complex. I don't believe, and I think the story out of the 77 riots is this, is that had we all gone beyond our personal fears, and I'm talking about all of us, including Glenn Henry Elliott, if we had all gone beyond our personal fears, that might have not happened like it did. So that story's got to be told, the fact that, and Jonathan and I have talked about some of that. So the long and short of it is that we got to do much more of this so that we get our story fully discussed and told.